You're listening to Educated Women Uplifted. I'm your host, Karen Lesnaw Scott, joined by Patty Belknap, and our guest today is Kim Timmins, the founder of KT Creations. I have a brief listener note before we begin. The focus of today's episode is Kim's story and how she has consistently advocated for herself and built a life on her own terms. However, to properly tell her story, this conversation will discuss the topic of spousal abuse. If this is a sensitive topic for you, please be advised as you listen along.
Kim is a multifaceted artist who works in oil, watercolor, pastel, ceramics, batik, and blown glass. She earned her Master's of Arts in Art Education from Texas Tech University and worked as a graphic and portrait artist after college. Kim lives in Burnet, where she taught art and inspired high school students for over 30 years. Kim, welcome to Educated Women Uplifted.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Kim, could you tell us a little bit about your childhood and the environment in which you grew up?
I grew up in a wonderful home that was probably maybe upper middle class, but it was lonely for me because I was the baby and my sisters were 10 and 12 years older than me. So they got out pretty quick. By the time I lived more like I guess you could say an only child almost. My dad worked out of the country a lot and my mother was taking care of her invalid mother who was Alzheimer's and had several broken bones right behind each other. So she was bedridden. So it was a loving home, but at the same time, in the place I came in birth, I'm the one that was just a little bit sometimes lonely. So other than that, it was wonderful home.
Nice to hear.
Your father overcame enormous hardship during the Depression and World War II. How did his story shape the way you approach adversity?
Well, I'm coming from a father that was a farmer, and his dad was very rough on them, when it came to his dad was a type of man back in the 1920s and teens that had kids to be their workers, in the farm. So I don't know that there was love there, but not at the level I think that we experience today with our children. And then he also was drafted in World War II. So when he got drafted, he married my mom real quick and ran, to leave. And he served 8 years, which was unusual because he served 4 years in the occupation. So, his family also, he sent all this money back to his family because mom and him got married quick. And he said, well, I'm just going to have them save my money and we'll get a house when I get out, and his family had stolen all of it and spent all of it. So when he came home after all that, he had nothing. So he put himself through University of Houston all by himself, bulldozed for the construction of University of Houston. And then he got hurt worse than he ever did in the war. He knocked his eye out with a limb when he was bulldozing.
Oh.
So it was kind of a rough depression and a rough, World War II, and then trying to get through it, but nothing stopped him. Nothing stopped mom and dad. He got his degree. Mom stayed home, with us and took good care of. At the time I wasn't around, but the girls were, my older sisters were. So he just kind of had a rough time.
That's quite a role model for you.
Yes.
Kim,
And
I wonder if you...
Remind me of it.
Oh, sure. Kim, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your first marriage and how you left.
Okay, well, I think I had baby fever real bad and I wanted to have a family. I think because I grew up alone, in my head I wanted 10 kids and the Partridge family, I guess it is. And I just decided that I think I married not choosing well. Does that make sense? I was just anxious to get going. And when he found out I was pregnant, he was okay with the first one, but the second one, he didn't. We weren't hurting for money. I was a graphic artist. So it wasn't a money thing. It was just a man thing that he didn't want another child. And he told me if I did not abort her, that I would be, that he would leave. Well, he left and took all the furniture and everything with him, and I've never seen him since. So that was abandonment. just literally leaving me. But I had a good job. I could make ends meet. It was rough, but I could do it. And then I made the mistake of finding, another one. And I decided then my choices are pretty bad in men. But the second husband I found was great to me, came in as a knight in shining armor, and and then the day we got married, after we got married, someone whistled at me in my wedding dress. You know what I meant? And he went and beat them up. And I've never seen any violence from him in my life, ever saw anything. Well, for the next 5 years, I had to deal with up, down, bipolar from him and being abused, physically. But he was a smart abuser. He was the one that would hold your head and scream in your ears, or he would hold you by the back of your arm. So if you wore shirts that came down to the elbow, none of the bruises would show, so I wasn't used to that. I was used to a loving home and a tough father, but a loving father,
Mhm.
Wow. And so after 5 years of it, I'll tell you later how I finally managed to get out of that, that was just a real rough time, especially with two little girls, but he was real smart about it. He didn't want anyone to know it. So, and I didn't realize how segregated I became from population and everything.
Mm.
I didn't realize how now that I've studied it and researched it, it all makes sense, but
Mhm.
at that time, it didn't make any sense to me. So does that answer your question?
So, Kim, you've spoken openly about surviving abuse and abandonment. Was there a moment when you kind of said, okay, I'm going to create a different story for myself and, more importantly, my children?
Right. You're absolutely right. I think the moment came when I found myself being very passive when he was abusive, very just taking it, just so one time he had knocked me on the bed and we had a footboard. So my knees were up in the air, and he never abused me in front of the girls, but this time he did. And they were 3 and 4 years old.
Mm.
I remember him choking the life out of me and me seeing that tunnel vision where it's just like it's on TV. It just goes into one little bitty circle. In that little circle, I looked over and saw my two daughters screaming for me and trying to reach me, climbing on the bed. And something went off in me like a lioness, just something. I just reached up and scratched his neck and I thought, fight. You got nothing to lose. Fight.
Mhm.
So I scratched him, but when I scratched him, he got so upset at me scratching me, he ran to look at his scratches, because he's a little vain, So I told him, and then I lied. I point blank lied. I said, I'm supposed to meet my mother. She's going to be at the front door any second. And if you don't want to see her abusing me, you better let me call her. That was all a lie. I called, and at the time we didn't have cell phones. So I called my mother and said, I'm sorry, I can't meet you for lunch today. And I'd never told her anything, but mothers are wise. My mother said, is he beating you right now? And I said, yes, mother, you've got it exactly. I'll meet you tomorrow at lunch. You know what I meant? She says, I'm coming with your father and police now. I said, please do. We'll see you then. So he couldn't get wind that I'd had it. I'm done, and, if it hadn't been for seeing my daughters, you understand, fight for me, they were fighting harder than I was fighting for me. That kind of started the pedals turning the other direction and going on a different way of life.
Mm.
No.
That story gives me goosebumps, and I can't even imagine living through that. And in fact, you've lived through some incredibly difficult seasons early in your life. What do you think gave you the resilience to keep um, rebuilding instead of giving up?
Well, number one, I'm a Christian. So God had been so much in my life, up to that point that I think he knew that I wouldn't fight till I saw my children. You understand? And if it hadn't been for support, I hadn't told my family anything. They had kind of thought it, but never, got wind of it. I think because of my Christian faith, God knew I wouldn't unseat myself unless he had to shock me like he did with the girls. So
Mhm.
I had prayed about it, had my friends pray about it. And one night That man was bad about breaking in my house, even though I had a court order. So in the middle of the night, he'd just wake up, hold my head screaming in it, and run out before I could call the cops. So one night I woke up to someone yelling because I just prayed to God what to do. I felt a booming voice that I'd never heard before tell me to go, get out of this town, go. And I woke up and I ran all over the house trying to find, and it wasn't him. I really believe it was God. Do you understand what I'm saying? Saying,
Mm-hmm.
you to move on, just move on, and then I just took, okay, God, I'm going to take this as you, and we're going. And I moved to Burnett then with my 2 little girls. And I was pregnant with his child at that time. I'd already lost one with him because he threw me down the stairs. So, I wasn't going to go through this with another baby, So I moved to little town of Little Burnett, Texas, where my parents had retired near so they could be of help if so.
So, Kim, you have lived through some incredibly difficult seasons of early life. I really admire the way you never gave up. I know that is probably hard. So, what gave you the resilience to keep rebuilding and instead of giving up?
I really think it was number one, my faith. Number two, my father and the resilience that came from them, and think of what my father had been through and my mother right along with him, through all that. I really believe that it was that one more step toward getting away. So every day,
Mm-hmm.
one, not 10, not 20, that
Right.
one more step. And then the more steps I took, the more confident I got, which got me, to where I.
So how did all this shape both your identity as an artist
Mhm.
and as an educator?
Well, I think now that I look back at it, then at the time I didn't think it was doing anything, but now that I look back at it, my mother, because she was taking care of her mother in the house, there was a neighbor that was taking her daughter to art lessons every Saturday morning. And she said, can I throw my daughter in with you? Because I can't leave the house, because she was looking after her mother that was bedridden. So she said, sure, come on. So I started painting, not even, realizing what it was starting, and that was my mother's way of loving me, is I think I've been to every church in the world, because whatever church someone was backing out their driveway into, Mom was sending me out there to get in that car. So I've been, I've been Baptist, I've been Assembly of God, I've been, but as long as I was in church, that was very important to me and to her to be part of that. Art has always been in my life. It's been the mainstay since I started back when I was a little girl, painting and learning different stuff, which moved into doing art stuff with my mother, which brought us closer, which brought me to a degree in art, which brought me to another degree in art, and so, as a teacher and as an educator, it's more of a, that stayed in my life. It was my consistent in mine. No one could take it away from me. It was something that I did for me. And then when I become an educator, you don't know how many times they'd call me in to counsel with kids that had been abused, because they said, we can't talk to them, but you have a way with them, because I understood. And one little boy, and I'll tell you maybe that story later, but I'll tell you real quick, one little boy, he wasn't bad. He was just like a little nit, that bothered you to death. We've all had those kids,
Yes, we have.
And so I wasn't teaching art then. I was teaching 5th grade because they cut art in all the programs around here. So I was teaching 5th grade. So his dad, big old burly guy, came in and looked at me and said, if he ever misbehaves you, I will take care of him. And he pointed at his belt like he was going to beat him, basically. And then I started to say, and then I saw that kid look out from behind his back, and the look in that kid's eyes was tears and true fear of not just a normal fear, a fear that this man was hitting harder than he should have been hitting him. Do you understand? So I looked at that man and said, he is the best boy in my class. I am so proud of him. And I know you need to be proud of him too. That kid was the best kid for me the rest of the year, because he looked at me and he just said, you understood when I looked at you what I was trying. And he looked at me and said,
Mm-hmm.
you with my eyes, and
Right.
that I understood that. So all of these things that have happened to me in my education and my art has come up in paintings and has come up in in just being a teacher and having the wealth of knowledge that I need to be able to get to that kid and see what I need to do to help them.
Thanks for sharing that. We've been talking a lot about resiliency, and I'd just like to ask what you think some people assume about resiliency that you think people are getting completely wrong.
I believe that most kids, I think resiliency, I think it's kind of emotion, sometimes. And I remember when I moved here, people didn't know where to put me. You know what I meant? Because I was pregnant. And in the state of Texas, you can't get divorced till you have the child.
That's right.
Church didn't know where to put me. Do we put her with the married people or do we put her with the singles? She's not single, and she's really kind of not married. So, and then I found a church that didn't care. Kim, you go where you want to go. You go where you're fed. Go sit in every class and you pick the one. I don't care if it's a kid's class, and that was a true Christians to me. But I believe the resiliency came from watching my mom and dad not give up, watching my mom and dad not give up on me. You know what I meant? And just do everything for me. No, they wanted me to do it for myself, and teach me, not what do you say? And most people think resiliency is mean or is, I don't know. My point was I couldn't feel any emotions at the time because I was doing good to survive and take the next step.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
cry. And some people don't think of resiliency as that. I think of resiliency as that because I had to get to the next meal. I had to get to the next, get my kid to school. I had to get to the next. And as long as I could take the next step with faith, I could make it through. So some people, I think resiliency is a misnomer, and then when I cry, I knew I'd worked my way through therapy and all through it that, okay, I'm getting there, but it's tiny steps sometimes at a time.
Absolutely.
It's amazing the strength we have within ourselves when we're forced to use it, isn't it?
Yes.
So true.
I mean, I completely understand where you're coming from. So before teaching, you worked as a graphic artist for Shell Oil. Wow. So how did that creativity first become such an important part of your identity?
Well, at the time, my dad had driven me to work, 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 work. You know what I mean? So you just
Yeah.
job, do whatever you got to do to keep it. But when you start to have 2 and 3 kids and 2 or 3 different daycare bills, yes, I could make it on my own, but it was real tough to make it as a single mom, with 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when I moved here. And I really believe that it was what's the word for it? It was my time away, which I think gave me a time away to be a good mother when I was a mother, when you're working. But at the same time, I was spread thin. The more children you have, it's different if you have 1 or 2 and you have great people, little grandmothers that can look after them, but I just decided it was better to go this direction. And I also, with Shell Oil, gave me a pride in myself.
Mm-hmm.
It was a graphic artist that I got this degree, I got this job, and I was holding it, So I think, and it was a graphic artist. So it was top secret. So I was in a little secret room because they were where they're going to be 5-10 years from now, and they didn't want anyone else to know it. And I did all the graphic arts.
Interesting.
So you essentially created your own teaching career from scratch. How did that happen?
Well, when I got here, I sold cosmetics and I lived in the housing authority. And as I made money, my rent and stuff went up, but that's what I needed was things to go up slowly so I could afford to live with my girls, with my 3 girls. So, I was teaching art classes and everyone knew me in town, this little town, as the artist, as the one that teaches all the kids because they had no art in any school whatsoever. So I had what they call a, little art class. And that's basically how I made my money when I got here was teaching art and selling cosmetics, and staying with my kids so I didn't have to hire. I hired a little old lady while they took a nap while I ran and delivered makeup, and then my art class they were part of. So those 2 things kept me going. Oh, you will love this part. Because we're a little town, you go to church with superintendents and principals and everything else. So I made an appointment with them. I was being very professional. And I said, look, you don't have art in any of these schools. And that's part of learning. These tactile kids need art. They've got to have art. And I'm willing to give myself to the district for an aid salary Now I have a degree in art, but those 2 years I'm going to be an aide. I'm going to be certified to teach pre-K through 6th grade, all subjects.
Mm-hmm.
So if art ever goes again, I can slide into the teaching position, you know? And so he looked at me and he said, "Are you serious?" I said, "I'm very serious." And he called all of his principals and told them I was calling and coming to see them and to get ready. You know, so I had told them because I'd already done art projects with them. There was no doubt in that I could teach it. You know, the advantage I found to doing it that way is I told them this: art is tactile, art is learning. And there's so many kids that are getting passed up because you're just papering them to death and they're not learning how to live basic life with working out things and with doing more physical things to learn with. And I said, "I promise you in 2 years, this is the deal I want to make with you. I'll give myself to use an aid salary. And in 2 years, you're either going to slide me into teaching pre-K through 6th, or I get to keep teaching art for a teacher's salary because I got to pay for my girls to go to school."
Mm-hmm.
So one of them called me and gave me the job as teaching art. And 2 years later, the first time, the highest scores Burnett Elementary has ever had, because I was an aide in first grade, in kindergarten, first and second. And they let me teach art, not only to all of them, but I also knew what they were teaching in the classroom that I could give them the benefit of my art lessons and how to, or what's the measurements of this wall? We're going to paint it. You understand? And doing art, I meant doing math. And then doing math in a different way than they've ever done it, not just paper, actually learning. I think one of the best lessons was the principal's in there watching me do it. She says, "I can't believe you did this." I had them pull out all their pencil bags. This was 5th grade. And I told them, "How many groups of 3, all your pencils, how many groups of 3 do you have?" And they'd say, "I have 4 groups of 3 with 2 left over. I have 5 groups of 3 with 2 left over." I said, "All of you just divided. You just divided. So when you see that division sign, you say, how many groups, not 23 divided by 2. I want to know how many groups of 3 you have." You know, and she said, if I hadn't seen it, I would never have believed it. And that year I got all the low math kids. And my deal with her was, I'm going to grow them a year plus 10 points. I don't know that I can get them all passing, but I'm going to grow them a year plus. Well, they all passed.
Amazing.
Every single one of them passed with high. But it was because I made it physical. And I asked parents, when you fill up with gas, you let your kids figure the money. You give your kid $20 and tell them this is all we got for groceries. How are we going to get through here? Remember, there's tax at the end. You know, so how are we going to do it? You know, so that was my kids' homework, was figuring out the groceries, you know, figuring out. Yeah, so, and I think it was just an unusual, there were so many kids that are not dumb. They just need to learn a different way.
Exactly. Exactly. But at the time, it was pretty unconventional, wasn't it?
Very.
I mean, you know,
I think that's why she was in there watching me saying, "I'm going to let you go." Yes, we're teaching Saxon. Yes, we're teaching this curriculum, but I'm having you teach an extra lesson just the way you did it just then, you know, because I said because I think people thought I was dumb growing up. But if they would have taught me that way, I would have got it. You know what I mean? I would have understood it better to understand how to do it. So I think art and it kind of, the physical, you know, and
the tactile. Yeah.
that's how Burnett made such high scores. They've never made such high scores in math and reading in their life. And I said, it wasn't the extra reading teacher that you paid, the 20, or the extra math teacher. It was just making it tactile.
Showing it a different way. Wow.
And we know that the research supports what you experienced. So it just makes it such a powerful anecdote that you're sharing.
Mm-hmm.
So, you were talking about working with children with incredibly difficult backgrounds. Was there a student or moment that permanently changed you as a teacher?
The one I told you about with the little boy, when I realized that sometimes I learned a lesson. When you teach a long time, you start to learn. Those kids you hate at the beginning of the year are the kids you wind up loving more than any of them. And the kids you love at the beginning of the year are the ones that you kind of ready to kick out. You know, kind of funny how that works. So you still love them. You just know that it's time those are the kids that came back. You know what I mean? Those are the kids that years later would come by and, "Hi, Miss Timmins," and, you know, and remembered you. I just laugh about, you know, about that. Anyway, so did that answer your question?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So you later built a successful AP art program. I personally have never heard of AP art.
Uh-huh.
And I took a lot of art growing up as well and taught a lot of art in my classroom. And but an AP art program, just that fascinated me. So what did you discover about young people by teaching that?
It started off, I had, you know how they throw everyone in art, so I had the low kids that couldn't pass. And my principal knows me well enough, give me challenges. And he said, Kim, you have all the low kids that aren't passing our state test, that aren't passing but he said they're not passing it by just a little bit. It's not a lot, but they're all in art. So he says, I want you to have a competition every 6 weeks. And he said that way they have to be passing all their other classes to get to go to that competition, and then that way we might have someone watching them they have to answer to for their grades. Now, this is high school level art,
Mhm.
so we're in high school, but they didn't have anyone to answer to. Majority of them were Hispanic, so because they don't necessarily keep up with grades as much as, or I don't know why. They just never had anyone look and watch them and tell them, you made a 79, you can make an 80, on your next report card, so it became a family and a group of all of us making, it work. All of a sudden at the end of the year, again, at the high school level, they blew the test off the things. And it was just those little bit of 10 percenters that needed moving up, that did it. But it also grew. It grew because I was there for so long to where now I'm getting the top of the top kids, that I'm getting the top 10 to 20, and they stay with me for 4 years. And the principal said, why are they all signing up for AP? And AP is 3 levels. So there's 3 levels of AP they can pass. There's drawing, there's photography, and then there's sculpture.
Mm.
So all of a sudden he came in and questioned the number one student and had been number one all the way through school. And he said, he just knew he'd caught me, and he did it in front of me on purpose. He said, what is the most challenging class you have here? Because I know you want to be a doctor. You're number one. You're going to A&M. And he said, art. And he said, art? He said, I thought you'd say science. He said, no. He said, because she gives us a problem and we have to solve it with making an art piece from it. So the problem might be something as simple as the borders. What borders are in your life that you can symbolize in a painting? So then
Mm.
now think about it. And one come up with curbs, came up with fences. And I said, now how are we going to do that in an art piece? All of you have been with me long enough. You know how to do art. We know technically how to paint. What are you going to do to get that message across in a painting? And he said, she makes me think. Everyone else tells me what to do, and I read over and get back on the test. He says her test is the art piece, and that's why we're getting such high scores in advanced placement, because they had to do a series on one topic. So their series, they really had to dig deep. It's okay if you change in the middle of it. You know what I meant? That's part of
Mhm.
it. We all change, He said she not only gave me life skills, but she gave me skills, that challenge everything in me. And he's a doctor today. And so it's good to see him and being
Wow.
Absolutely. What a
That's fabulous.
and I
wonderful
think he felt
answer for
tired
him
when
to
the
give.
principal had asked him because he thought he was going to say science. You know how that
Mm.
goes. So
It's a credit to you and your hard work that you've put forward. So at some point, your creativity expanded into glass blowing and building your own studio. So what drew you into that world?
I had to stay on my toes with these AP kids. Having high schoolers for 4 years in a row, I had to keep the challenges going for me and for them. And they knew during the summer I made like crazy and would teach it the next year and something new or something different. So I decided to go to Texas Tech and get my master's in art education. So that art education took me to higher, levels to keep me pushing them and me not getting bored, you know, and they never saw my artwork. I mean, they saw they might have seen a few finished pieces, but I wanted them to do their own thing, not copy me. So, but they knew, but we all hung out all of our paintings when we came back from summer because they had a summer assignments too. So they enjoyed that. And I think going to Texas Tech pushed me, to push myself for the kids. Yeah.
Wonderful.
So you seem to have a pattern throughout your life, really, of creating opportunities instead of waiting for permission, which I admire greatly. Where do you think that mindset comes from?
Well, I was thinking about this real hard, and I think it was coming from my dad, I think, bottom line, because when I was at my lowest of low and he took me on pregnant, moving here, moving into the housing authority, I told him, I'm going to sell cosmetics. I'm working my way off of this. I'm not staying on staying on low income. I'm going to get there, but it's going to take a little longer because I've got little ones with me, so I think him one day, my mother told me, if you won't say anything to him at dinner time, he won't start on you. So, and mother said, I can't eat. My mother lost 90% of her stomach to ulcers taking care of her mother. And she said, I can't eat for you two bantering at each other. It was fine for me and dad. Me and dad could push each other, but it upset mom. So I said, Mom, I won't say a word, this time. He can get me all he wants. And finally, by the end of it, he sat up and said, well, I guess you agree with everything I just told you about yourself, And my mother said, no, I made her promise she would not respond to you. And he said, I know you, you're like me. And if I can, and he said, if I can push you to take that next step, I know you'll do it. So what I mean, I think it was, he thought if he took the opposition that I would prove him wrong by doing it. So I really think that him and my good loving mother who lived through us bantering at each other, was huge. And and my kids, I had to keep going. How can I show a daughters that you don't stay here and get hit? You stand up for yourself. And it took me seeing them to get there. So, and by the way, I've been extremely married for the last 33 years to a wonderful man that took them all on as his own and adopted every one of them. So I'm saying that going through, that, but I went through counseling, everything else, to make sure, so I didn't want to end it on a bad note or,
Oh, it's helpful for you to share that. Thank you so much. You've been so open about a lot of that. And another thing, Kim, that you're really great at is making opportunities or making things happen for yourself. So do you have 3 ideas that you could share with our audience what they could do to create their own opportunities?
I think the 3 biggest things, I really thought about this, was support system. I had a group of women praying around me and loving me just the way I was and pushing me to go to the next step, giving me all their kids to teach art to, you know what I mean? Just, when you have a group that clicks and loves you. So support system, you need people that you can tell the worst to and they still love you. You know what I mean? You need those strong people. And then I want to invest something in the future. So I don't care if it's $5 a week. When I was living in the housing authority, I had a jar and we managed to invest in what our plans were for the next 10 years. So we have to put money back now to make sure we have something later. I don't care if it's $1 a week. So teaching my kids and me that. So when I do get there, I've got some money that will help, with that kind of stuff. And research. I read books all the time. I try things and fail, all the time. But because I have that little bit of investment, it's okay to fail. This is my fail money. You know what I mean? But also I'd say 85% of it works, So that's where the blowing glass came in. When I went to Texas Tech, I had done everything. I walked into a class and there was one of my students teaching the class. And she said, I can't teach her. So she said, but I know her well enough. Come with me, so I followed her down to the glass blowing. I said, I know you haven't done this, and then I started glass blowing and watching it. And it was just such a different type of art, and you get kind of spellbound by it very easily. It's a lot harder than it looks, but I wasn't good at it, but I just stayed with it till I got there.
So you continue through your entire life, Kim, reinventing yourself. You've been an artist, a teacher, an entrepreneur, a speaker. Which part of it was the very hardest?
I think when I got my master's, again, I'd done everything in their master program, being a teacher, and they knew I was very much a part of College Board AP. And they said, we don't know what we have to teach you. And I looked at them and said, can I make my own last class? And they said, yes. And they said, here's the budget. You have to write the curriculum and I took myself by myself to North Carolina and rented a house there. And then I Skyped back in to the classroom at Texas Tech and instructed them on everything that I was doing. I was plein airing. So I would hike that mountain to go to the waterfalls, and I would sit there and get the water out of the waterfalls, take my batiks. In other words, you're hiking, okay? But hiking by yourself and doing it all by yourself is different than when you're doing it for someone or with someone or otherwise.
Mhm.
And I even would tell the forest ranger, okay, I'm going these 3 places. If I'm not out of this state forest or national forest by this time, my husband's going to call you and you got to go look those 3 places for me, because I'm alone,
Right.
So, I made it back every night. So it wasn't an issue, but I sat there and painted the waterfalls on the spot. So I used the water out of the waterfalls, the batik I could take powder form, and it was just cloth that I could carry. So it was easy to hike with. I didn't have to have a lot of water, so it was nice. I learned a great deal about myself because I didn't have my husband to carry the heavy stuff in. He had spoiled me, with that kind of stuff. I stayed up in the mountains, and I even went to a glass blowing place, up there. And then afterwards, part of it was, instead of when you get your master's, you sit down and professors grill you on what you do and everything, and you better answer right.
Mhm.
And I looked at them and said, I don't want that. I want to show all the art and glass I've made. And one professor said, she has more work than any of us. She has
Yeah.
she has enough work to fill a gallery. We already know she can argue all of us under the table. So why not, if she's showing us that she's doing it for this budget and this curriculum, why not let her do it? And she can teach our kids. And every other day I would come in. I didn't know it. I was facing the wall with the Skype. And then one time they said, Kim, the first time it turned around 25 kids, in the room. By the 3rd week, because it was 3 weeks long that I was by myself, they turned it around. There's 275 kids in there.
Wow.
My.
And half of them were still mine. I mean, were mine that I had before,
Wow.
It's
So I
really
would send
neat.
them pictures and I would send them what I was doing and walk around and show them what I was doing. So it was the fact that I wrote my last, hoorah, and I took a weekend, put a whole gallery together, and then I showed for the next, 2 weeks at the Texas Tech Gallery. All the stuff. And what was fun, I made glass bubbles for my waterfall. So the batiks were the waterfalls, and I put water in a tray and I floated all my bubbles, for the waterfalls. So I have, all my little waterfalls that I did.
So inspiring and creative. So, Kim, if someone listening feels stuck or discouraged or like life has not gone their way, what would you want them to hear from your story?
Number one, if you're failing, you've got to step out. Why not? You've got to change something. In your heart in your life when things aren't right, and I should have known, but of course I wouldn't have a kid if it hadn't been for, for going through what we went through, what I went through. But at the same time, number one, why not? You got nothing to lose. You've already lost everything.
Mhm.
Number one. Number two, those other things that I talked to you about, a support system and investing, and don't be afraid to try. Don't be afraid to, even when I still do booths or make glass. Okay, this didn't work, but what am I going to do different next time? And research it. Don't be afraid to ask. And my daughter brought up a thing today. She says, Mom, I've been known to go, I wanted to paint plein air with famous artists. So one of the judges of one of the competitions that I did looked at my artwork and said, you need to change this, this, and this. Well, I changed them all that night, sent her pictures. And she said, you have done all these changes. You listened to me and did every single thing I asked you to do. So she says, I need you to come and you need to come take from me once a week. So I drove 2 hours to San Antonio just to be in that group. Well, they were having a big paint out with very famous painters in Utah. And I said, I want to be part of that, but I can't afford the whole thing, but I could maybe come 1 week, And when you're sitting in the middle of that much talent by yourself, and I meant just, it's so full of wealth of knowledge. And I was known to not let them go once I got hold of them. Okay, why are you doing this? Okay, why are you doing this? Okay, what do you do for this? How do you sell? So I've been so blessed with them being put in my path, and I think it's through prayer and I know it's going to turn around. Things are going to turn around. I'm not rich by any means, but I'm rich in what I have around me. Not money, not wealth, but in the wealth of knowledge that I've been able to glean from these people. And they could never get me in, but I told Tracy, I said, my husband's Tracy. I said, you just watch. One of them had to drop out, and they called me and they said, look, everyone has your name on their tongue. Will you come join the one that left? And of course, within a day's time, I was there and
You were
stayed.
there.
So I meant it was just look for the opportunities and expect them. God wants to give them to us. God wants us to step out and do that. So just do it. Just don't be afraid. So what if you fail? Yeah, you're going to fail. But that's how 10 years later, I have a glass shop, out my that I can go out there in pajamas.
Right.
I'm teaching, and I teach. I think that's a big part of it is I enjoy the teaching of the little kids how to blow glass, so.
Well, Kim, I cannot thank you enough for sharing your story and for teaching us how to create our own opportunities. I think that that's very, very important in today's world for us to be willing to step out and try new things and continue to learn no matter what stage of life we are in.
Yes, thank you for sharing your story, and thank you at home for listening to us today. And if you've enjoyed hearing Kim's story and about her work, please share this episode with your friends. Thank you.
Thank you.